Standing behind me is a North American P-51D Mustang, and this one's called the Rebel. This is a plane that needs absolutely no introduction and was one of the most iconic fighters of World War II. Make no mistake about it, when you walk up to this plane for the first time, it is a lot bigger than you see in photos. It also has a huge ramp presence, most notably because of the tail wheel on the back of the airplane. Here you can see the exhaust from the V12 Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that was installed in the Mustang after the A variant. Walking around the side of the airplane, you've got very obvious gear doors here, lovingly referred to as the barn doors, followed by 3 50 caliber machine guns, 1 set on each side, so 6 in total. This pylon is for carrying bombs, as well as external fuel tanks capable of carrying up to 550 pounds. Moving along the side of the wing, you'll notice the very shiny finish of this aluminum P-51. That is not a mistake, that is by design, so when you look up from the ground to the sky, the Mustang would be lost in the blue and gray haze. I mentioned this is a D model. One of the most notable features to point out is the bubble-shaped canopy of the D model. A very easy way to tell the B and the C from the D is this canopy right here. Moving to the back of the airplane, you notice a star and bar that is very iconic to any American World War II airplane. Back we have the tail, where the elevator and the rudder are housed. And something you absolutely can't tell from a lot of videos, but you do notice in person if you get close enough, is that 95% of this airplane-ish is covered in aircraft aluminum, right? Obvious. However, the tail section right here is actually wrapped in fabric. So that was a practice that was done leading up to World War II and early 1900s all across aviation, with starting with the Wright Flyer and on up in the 20s and 30s. But into World War II, they started really getting into a lot of metal aircraft. However, they kept the tail wrapped in fabric to reduce weight and improve handling at high speeds. Also, fabric is much cheaper than metal, and if I had to guess, the cost savings were an added benefit during the war effort. And the trim tab is also back to metal. So it's funny, metal, fabric, metal. The wings on the P-51 are also very iconic and very special. They have what's called a laminar-flow design. Laminar-flow means that the thickness of the wing is actually moved farther back than what would have traditionally been put in on some of the other fighters at the time. This allows for reduced drag and improved speed performance. Also, to help with this design, for a while out of the factory doors, they would actually putty up these rivets. You can see there's a bunch of rivets all along the wing, which are very common in most aircraft with metal wings. They would put putty on them so to keep the smoothness of the wing intact and to reduce the drag. However, that actually stopped in around early 1944 when they couldn't produce P-51s fast enough for the war effort. You notice right below the canopy here, there's Captain Joe Joyner printed in big, bold letters. Captain Joyner was a U.S. Army Air Forces fighter pilot during the war. He flew 84 combat missions, as well as received 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 9 air medals. One of my favorite parts of any World War II era aircraft are the enemy kills put on the side of the airplane. This is obviously a Nazi swastika from Germany, and this case represents 1, 2, 3, 4.5 kills. That means that the plane that this represents at the time that it would be replicated from would have killed 4 enemy planes, as well as gotten credit for half of one, which means that there was another US aircraft involved potentially in the dogfight to take it down. Okay, so this is really neat and worth pointing out. This is a very obvious and decently sized hole to the left of where the pilot would sit in the cockpit. This is actually where he would fire a flare gun and fire out flares. Different colored flares meant different things. There was green, red, and white, and sometimes yellow. Green would mean that everything's fine. Probably, if I had to guess, if he's flying by a tower over Britain and saying, hey, I don't have any radio communications, shoot out a green flare, but everything's fine. Red would have meant, obviously, there's an emergency, and white or yellow would mean something is wrong with the airplane and I need assistance. So pretty cool. It just so happens, also, that I have one of those actual flare guns right here. Not sure if I'm supposed to do that. One of the most iconic features of the Mustang is the very obvious belly scoop underneath the airplane. This is an air intake for the oil cooler as well as a radiator. It is pretty massive, very noticeable from the side and from the front, and you would think that it would actually cause a tremendous amount of drag. Well, that's actually not the case. What happened was there was something known as the Meredith effect. Air would go in there and actually make up for about 90% of the drag caused from the size of the metal protruding out, and it would give it that much thrust. So it actually did produce thrust behind the airplane, which is really interesting. Moving aft behind the engine cowling, right where the wing starts to come out, you'll notice it says gun camera. So this was actually a 16mm video camera that was placed inside the left wing of the Mustang. Every time the pilot would pull down and fire his 650 caliber machine guns, this would record a couple seconds of black and white 16mm footage. This was so that US and British intelligence could confirm the enemy kills once the plane was safe on deck and landed. One of the coolest features of the Mustang are the 350 caliber machine guns on each wing. So that's 3 on one side, 3 on the other, so 6 total. They are actually offset. You can see that this one sticks out the farthest. This one's sort of in the middle where you think it would be, and this one is actually recessed. This was actually some really smart engineering to fit them all inside the Mustang's thin laminar flow wing. This design allowed for clean, reliable ammo feed paths and proper ejection, all without compromising the wing structure. But despite the staggering, the guns were still angled to converge at a set distance ahead of the airplane, all centered on the pilot's bullseye. The main mission of the Mustang was to serve as a bomber escort overseas in occupied Europe. Now, it did serve in the Pacific theater as well as North Africa, but when you think of the Mustang, oftentimes you think of it flying over occupied France or Germany during the war. So the British were actually first to request a redesign of one of their aging aircraft, the P-40. However, North American came back to them with a new design, which would ultimately become the P-51 Mustang. It only took them 102 days, which is extremely fast considering the war was happening. There are several different Mustangs that exist, the A, B, C, D, K, and TF. The A was the first one that came out with the Allison engine. The British didn't like this, and I don't blame them. It only had a ceiling of 20,000 feet. This was a big problem because the B-17s that this was designed to escort would cruise at 30,000 feet. So by the time the B model came out, the Brits decided to put in a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with a 2-stage supercharger. The only problem was the British couldn't produce it fast enough because they were being bombed by Germany. So they signed an agreement with Packard Motor Car Company in the States, which produced under license a Rolls-Royce Merlin with a 2-stage supercharger behind it, V12 engine. The pilots ultimately fell in love with that. The B and the C were basically the same. The C's were actually just created in Dallas, Texas, and the B's were manufactured in Inglewood, California. But most notably with the B and C models where they had 2 50 caliber machine guns on each wing, so 4 in total, as well as the canopy was a little bit more restrictive with visibility. They did not have the dome canopy. So by the time the D variant came out, North American put in a bubble canopy, which the pilots loved. The pilots loved the increased visibility on the canopy so much that they were totally okay with sacrificing a couple extra knots of airspeed in order to get the visibility, because the difference between life and death is a couple extra seconds in good visibility. Also, by the time the D variant came out, they added 150 caliber machine gun on each wing, so that increased it to 6 in total. There was no E model because at the time the Army designated E with experimental aircraft, so that was skipped. The K was replaced towards the end of its lifetime, I believe after the war, and the only difference between the K and the D was a different propeller, which ultimately had worse performance than the D model had anyway. There's also the TF Mustang, which came out after the war. TF stands for Trainer Fighter. So of the 7 aircraft that are here at this complex today, several of them are TF Mustangs. They removed a couple things such as the flare gun hole in the side, but they were designed with 2 full seats in mind. Now this Mustang right here actually has 2 seats. They actually retrofitted after the war to take out a little bit of fuel storage, put in a bit of a jump seat, as it were, behind the pilot. But the TF was designed with the extra seat in mind from the get-go. Now, what's interesting is after the D and the TF models came out, the Air Force actually designated the P-51 Mustang to become the F-51 Mustang. So the P in P-51 stands for pursuit. That was a name given to them by the British. So we all know today is a P-51, but after the war ended into Korea, it was known as the F-51. Some other fun facts on this D model we have in front of us: it has a ceiling of 41,900 feet, which is extremely high. The P-51 Mustang D had a range of 1,650 miles, which was almost double the initial range of the spec aircraft of the A model, and this included external tanks. The P-51D also had a 3,200 feet per minute climb rate, as well as a G limit of +8 Gs and -4 Gs. The takeoff distance was 1,200 feet with a landing rollout of 1,500 feet. It was so successful towards the end of the war with both American and British pilots that it is responsible for creating over 275 aces in the war. And in order to be an ace, you need to have 5 confirmed enemy kills. So this bad boy right here is responsible for 275 of them on the Allied side during the war. Pretty impressive. Okay, in order to climb up on the wing, the pilots would actually come in via the front, so they would get up on the tire and jump over. So we're gonna do that right now. So get my leg up on the tire, put my butt here, and swing up and now I'm on top of the wing. I would not come in from the back. There's a big no step sign. So there's actually a red lever here on each side. It's a little bit of a two-person operation to open the canopy. So got some help earlier, cracked it open. But once you get to this point, actually reach your hand in, grab the lever, and you can rotate it back like this all the way. So getting into the canopy, pretty self-explanatory. Do my best not to step on the seat. Grab onto the hood here, sit over. I'll show you what it looks like to close the canopy. You push down on this lever, which you can't see from this angle, and you rotate it like this. So now the canopy is essentially closed, and you can see by me looking around, I've got tremendous visibility. I mean, if my hand was on the stick, I could look back there and see an enemy coming from behind me, no problem. The B and the C models would have not been this amazing with the view, and it would have been a lot harder to see, which is why the D model had this as a request put in. Also remember that these were single piloted airplanes, right? The pilot was flying the airplane, also served as the navigator and the bomber and gunner. So they had to do all things, and keeping their head on a swivel and having the visibility to see in all directions, 360 degrees around, is literally the difference between life or death. So this is really cool to sit inside. It's also my first time ever sitting in a P-51 Mustang. So this is really cool. To open the canopy, I'm gonna grab this lever and just crank it in the reverse direction. Now, obviously this wouldn't have any air conditioning back in the 40s, and this one certainly does not today. So it gets hot. A lot of pilots would taxi around with the canopy open until they would get to take the runway, close the canopy, and there is some ram air that would come in from the cockpit to get some cool air in. Also on that note, if it's hot on the ground, it could easily be many, many tens of degrees below freezing Celsius in the air. I mean, at the end of the day, this is thin aluminum. And when you're flying up at 35,000 feet for 6 hours at a time, because you've got a 1,400 nautical mile range, it gets cold and lonely, and a lot of times they couldn't break radio silence. So just imagine being up in the cockpit by yourself, not talking to anybody really, looking out for specks in the sky. Different times. Here we are inside the cockpit. You can see just how tight it is. There are my knees. And if you see here, there's a couple of modern touches with this cockpit, some Garmin avionics here, but there are some pretty basic, what would have been the same instrumentation in a six-pack style format that you would find on a World War II era P-51 Mustang. Here's a stick right here, which they would have held with their right hand, left hand on the throttle. Now, the P-51 during the war would have had a mounted heads-up display here. In fact, red dots that you see on pistols and rifles today came from these military aircraft in World War II. It had a couple different settings. One was air-to-air, the other was air-to-ground, and one was both. To fire the 50 caliber machine guns, you would pull the trigger. You got 3 on the left, 3 on the right, and that would line up with a reticle or a bullseye in front of the airplane that the pilot was looking at through his heads-up display. Another thing worth pointing out is this glass is extremely thick right in front of the pilot, whereas on the side is what you'd expect glass to normally feel like. You can even see it here from the side. This is every bit of an inch and a half thick. This is obviously so that if a bullet was coming at you head on, it at least gave you some sort of protection from a head-to-head strafing run. Makes you feel warm and fuzzy at night knowing that at least the front of your head is protected, but good luck from the side. Here's the left and right bomb salvo levers, which is what they use to drop the bombs when needed, or if they need to drop the external tanks, obviously once they ran out of fuel, or if they were flying along and they got intercepted by the enemy, you to drop the tanks for weight, they would literally just release the lever. This is what the backseat of the Mustang looks like. Again, we are in a D model, so this would have not have been made with a backseat off the factory line, but it was retrofitted after the war to be able to carry passengers and such. If I was going to own a P-51 Mustang myself someday, I would absolutely want a backseat to bring along my best friend. You can see just how tight this cockpit is for me. If I go ahead and close the lever here, or they get the canopy closed, I'm not even wearing a headset or a helmet, and well, I actually got a couple inches, so it's a little bit bigger than I thought it was going to be, but a little bit narrow and not a lot of wiggle room. The main reason for that is because this was designed in the 40s, and the average pilot was an 18 to 22-year-old young man flying at the time that weighed about 150 pounds and was no more than 5 feet 8 inches tall. Whereas today we're all over 6 foot and a little bit bigger. So when you're flying in a P-51 Mustang these days, it's a lot tighter than it would have been at the time during the war. Other things to note in the cockpit, this big red emergency pull lever would have been emergency release for the canopy. Also right here we have the O2 regulator for the oxygen. So because this had a ceiling of 41,900 feet, this is what the pilots would plug into to breathe oxygen. One of the main reasons this was such a beloved fighter is because it would cruise around 35,000 feet, and the B-17s that they were escorting would be at around 30,000 feet. So they had plenty of power and speed to get up high in a hurry, but also they had the oxygen to stay there for a long period of time. Here we have a fuel shutoff valve as well as the fuel valve for switching between the tanks. So you can see we've got the main left and the main right fuselage tanks as well as the combat left and right drop tanks. So to drop the tanks would be over here with this lever, but to actually decide which tank the fuel is coming from would have been with this lever right here. To the left of my legs is the landing gear handle. It's very obvious in red and it says landing gear on the side. There's as well as a chart, and to lower the landing gear you simply push the handle down. To raise the gear you pull it up. This is also the flap handle. That's very obvious in yellow, and it's hard to see, but there are different degrees. Up is all the way right here. The flaps are obviously down, and then 10, 20, all the way down to 50 degrees for the flaps, which is what they're at currently. There's a very iconic NAA logo, which stands for North American Aviation. Another fun fact about the Mustang is the airspeed indicators in miles per hour. This is true to the time period, as opposed to most airspeed indicators today in aircraft, which are in knots. But back in the 40s, it would have been in miles per hour. This is a great shot of what it looks like from the cockpit, and you can see that there's really not any good visibility in front of the airplane from where the pilot would sit. So once this canopy is closed, you're actually not sticking your head out past this point to be able to see what's in front of the plane. So in order to make up for this lack of visibility, pilots to this day, if they're flying a Mustang, will do what's called S-turn. So they actually taxi on the runway in these big S's so that you can see what's to your left, and you taxi back, see what's to your right in front of you. They can't see directly in front of them, mostly because we have the tail wheel on the back of the airplane and the decent sized tires, which is creating this angle that you can't see with the front. Plus huge propellers and a very long cowling. It's damn near impossible to see what's in front of the airplane. So S-turning is a big deal when it comes to most tail wheel aircraft, especially when we're talking World War II fighters. Now, instead of going out the front, which is how we came up, I'm actually going to slide off the back. So you kind of hop up over the wing onto the front and you slide off the back, avoiding the no step signage right here. Okay, I just stepped into one of the many hangars here at the American Honor Foundation, where they have 3 other P-51 Mustangs, as well as an F-5 Freedom Fighter below a very iconic and very huge American flag. Pretty sweet. This might be the largest private collection of P-51s in the world. They have 7 in their collection, all of which are in flying condition. Actually, every airplane at the museum is in flying condition. They have a full-time maintenance staff, as well as mechanics and pilots to fly these things. It's unbelievable. But I wanted to show you the replica of the fuel tank that would have been strapped onto the P-51. So the British actually came up with an ingenious design and concept for the fuel tanks that were mounted on the P-51s. They were in fact made of paper, basically cardboard with a shellac coating on the outside. They were good for 10 hours, which was just enough time to load the fuel tanks with fuel, load them onto the airplanes underneath on the bomb pylons, and then they were able to fly over occupied Europe. And by the time they got to Germany to fight off the Luftwaffe, oftentimes they were out of fuel just before the tanks basically expired and started rotting through, and they would drop the tanks and be slick aircraft fully loaded with gas on normal tanks to be able to fight the Germans. Pretty cool concept, and I think it's really neat they got the replica here to show you in person. Another glaring piece of history that comes to mind when you think of Allied forces flying over Europe in World War II is something called Black Thursday. So on October 14th, 1943, 60 B-17 bombers were lost in one single day. If you do simple math, that's 60 planes times 10 men in each airplane. That's over 600 men lost in one day. This day in history is exactly why the Mustang was invented. The Allies were looking for a fighter escort to be able to fly with the B-17s and the bombers from England over to Germany, and they did not have the range or the capability to do so at the time. That is until the Mustang was invented. There's actually a very famous quote by one of the German generals that once he saw the Mustangs over the skies of Germany, he knew the war was lost. Once the German Luftwaffe was basically defeated, no longer flying over the skies, the P-51 took on the bomber role and would actually strafe several trains around Europe and in Germany to try and cut off the German supply lines. Something they did all throughout the war, but especially once the escort role disappeared from their mission, they took on a very specific bombing and strafing role all across occupied Europe. And now it's time to give this Mustang a flyby score. The P-51D is an absolute legend in the air, delivering world-class performance and an unmatched stick and rudder experience. Its speed, range, and handling make it one of the greatest warbirds of all time. But ownership in the 21st century, that's a different story. It's costly, impractical for most pilots, and more of a historical investment than a daily flyer. That said, few aircraft command the same level of admiration and respect. Its cool factor and legendary status give it value beyond just dollars and cents. This is the ultimate dream machine for warbird lovers, but be ready to pay for the privilege. I just want to give a huge shout out to the American Honor Foundation here in Ocala, Florida for giving me access to this incredible P-51D Mustang behind me, as well as some of their other iconic World War II and Vietnam era aircraft in the hangars to my side. Those videos are coming out soon. Also, if you like this video, be sure to check out the Aerial Firefighting Edition Kodiak 100 review I just published on my channel. Link is in the description. Until next time, I'm Rob Roy from flybuyer.com, and I'm out of here. See ya!